I mean, yeah, well, we can start recording since the time is on. And
Yep.
I was thinking we would record when it really starts, but it's not a problem. So let me check the agenda again. What is my part to play?
Yeah.
Okay. Two more minutes. And we can go. So you can maybe start sharing your screen in preparation. All right. Yes, we can. We can say it. Okay. How many people do we have now?
We have 4 people now, 4 attendees now. I think we should just wait a little bit more. What do you think?
Okay. Yeah, of course. We may have Uh, okay. Yeah, just fix this guy. All right. Somebody else told me he's about to join. I think, well, maybe we wait 3 more minutes. But then
Okay, so we start
for those that are,
by 10 minutes past 4, right?
yeah, of course. But those that are in already, so we don't just keep staring at the screen. They can start dropping their name, the organization,
Okay.
just a little bit of information about them. Yeah. Yeah. So
Hi,
you can
hi
just
everybody.
kickstart it now.
Hi everybody. Good morning, good
Hello.
afternoon, good evening, depending on what part of the world you're joining us in from. So you're welcome. Well, my name is Ariel Damlola. I'm the research officer for One Health in Action initiative. And with me, I have Dr. Dauda Onawala. I'll allow him to introduce himself. Dr. Dauda, introduce yourself before I go on. Full introduction, don't just wave at us.
All right. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Dauda Onawala. I'm the Executive Director of One Health in Action Initiative. And for short, OHIA. OHIA is a youth-led One Health organization that aims at bringing One Health research into public health actions that can benefit all lives. Yeah, and we are very, very happy to host you again for the second episode of One Health in Action Initiative. One Health Scenario episode. I understand that some of you came for the first episode and you learned a lot, and I can promise you it's still going to be the same thing today. You have so much of new information that you've never had before and things you can translate into practical actions on your own, whether as an individual or a part of an institution, which is the primary aim of our organization, to help people understand how they can localize actions that translate into One Health and how to help establish a healthy society and communities for all lives, not just human beings. So at this point, I'll leave it to the moderator and the facilitator to do justice to the topic we have at hand today.
Thank you, Dr. Dawud.
Decolonizing climate
Yes.
health justice
Climate and
through
health
public
justice.
education. Thank you.
Yep. Welcome, everyone. Please kindly drop your name, the country you're joining in from in the comments, in the chat box, sorry. So I think I can introduce our speaker now, Dr. Dauda. Do I have the go ahead?
Yes, please.
Okay. So with us here today is Hazel Patricia Naginda. She's going to be doing justice to the topic, decolonizing climate and health justice through public education. So she's someone that is very passionate about climate change, and she's just generally a climate educator and a software engineer of Climate Operation, a youth-led organization that has the goal to make climate education for young people in the global south more relevant and less scientific. So you can count on her today to break down all the, bit education for everyone here to understand. She is passionate about fostering more open and inclusive spaces where young people like us, regardless of where they stand on the climate debate, can engage in open dialogue and work together on pertinent climate solutions that will benefit relevant climate action in the developing world. So like I said before, we have just the right person to do justice to this topic. And we'll be giving her the floor. Hazel, please say hi. Say hi to the audience. I'm sure everybody is eager. Just introduce yourself again. Short, brief. If there's anything I left out, you can just add it and go on.
Amazing. Thank you, Damilola, for the introduction. And hi, everyone. As Damilola said, I'm Hazel Najinda, the founder of Climate Operation. And basically, the work that we do is around climate education and making sure that young people are engaged in climate action and that the climate education that they're actually receiving is very relatable, it's non-scientific, and it's really interesting for them. Something else about me is that I am part of the Envisioning Environmental Equity Collaborative, which is a collaboration between Race and Health, the University of Sao Paulo, and YACAP. And basically the work that we are doing is around decolonizing climate and health. And that is the reason why I'm here, because we'll be talking about decolonizing climate and health justice through public education. I will just go through a couple of slides as I speak. So we could go to the next slide.
Okay, thank you, Hazel. So, Dr. Dauda, do we have to go to start?
Yeah, please proceed.
Okay, so everyone, I suggest you get your, papers and pens, because we are going to be jotting down a lot of insightful, thoughts and all that. So please, Hazel, you have the floor.
Yeah, so just some housekeeping rules. It's a Zoom webinar event we're hosting, so you may not be able to drop, you may not be able to unmute yourself and speak at any point, but you can use the chat box to interact. If you have any question, ask. Yeah, it's not an in-class presentation. It's an interactive section, so you will welcome questions and input and anything from anyone as we proceed. Thank you.
Yeah, just like Dauda said, this is a very interactive session. So if you have a question, drop it in the chat. The main essence of this is to just have a conversation around climate and health, as well as public education, right? So just to go through what I'll be talking about, we shall talk about we have already done the introduction. So we'll be talking about what climate change is and how it intersects to climate justice, because I feel like that is very key in this conversation. Then we shall also talk about the negative impacts of the climate crisis. And here we'll be focusing on the negative health impacts of the climate crisis. And then we shall talk about climate response equity. So basically taking a look at the past and present inequalities and how those have actually intensified the climate crisis. Then we shall dive into the Envisioning Environmental Equity Educator's Guide that was developed by the EEE Collaborative. So here I'll be talking about what it is, who it's for, and how all of us can leverage it. And then we shall open up the discussion to questions and everything. So we could go to the second slide. The next slide. Cool. So first we're going to talk about what is, global warming and how it impacts society. So I would reckon all of us in the audience know what the climate crisis is, but something that I would love to chat about and to also explain is the fact that global warming and climate change goes beyond the increase in temperature, and the fact that it actually has impacts on human society. And for example, here we have the fact that an example in this slide is the fact that the heat waves in Pakistan have actually intensified, and that has actually impacted the way in which the people are living. And another example, if we go to the next slide, is, for example, in the Marshall Islands, where because of sea level rise, the people there are finding it very unlivable, as well as in Burundi, because of the rise of heat, it's actually affecting the way in which farmers are actually farming. So that is why we need to actually speak about the climate crisis with a climate justice lens, because with a climate justice lens is when we actually get to acknowledge the fact that climate change is impacting everyone, but it's not impacting everyone equally. In Burundi, in the Marshall Islands, and in Pakistan, because these countries, one, are not at the same societal as well as economic standpoint as countries in the global north, then that means that when the impacts of the climate crisis actually affect them, they are not able to withstand them equally, as opposed to, let's say, if something happens in Germany or something happens in the US or something happens basically in a global north country. And that is why we always need to look at climate change with a climate justice lens. The next slide. So the next thing we would need to also really acknowledge is that a more significant burden of the impacts of climate change is carried by poorer nations weathering climate-induced environmental shocks. So from this image here, we see that countries in the global south, despite of the fact that they are emitting less carbon dioxide, they're actually the ones that are being impacted the most by the impacts of the climate crisis, as opposed to countries in the global north that are emitting the most, and they're actually not being affected the most by the impacts of the climate crisis. And I believe it's actually because of this that now we are now seeing policymakers, we are seeing climate activists demanding for more climate finance from the global north, because we are at this point whereby the impacts of climate change are now more devastating than ever, and countries in the global south can no longer actually adapt or mitigate these impacts. So now we are now seeking for more climate finance from the global north. Next slide. So now we go on to how past, present inequalities have contributed to climate change. So by inequalities, we are talking, because I would reckon and I would also acknowledge that we have very many inequalities in the world today. But today I'll be just speaking on two, and that is colonialism and racism. So last year, the IPCC, which is the International Panel on Climate Change, acknowledged that colonialism is a historic and ongoing power structure that drives climate change and communities' vulnerability to it. So how does colonialism actually contribute to climate change? An example, and I believe for us who are from Africa, most of the African countries were colonized by the British. And during these times, the British actually took a lot from Africa in terms of resources. And because of this, it left most African countries very barren. And because of this, they cannot actually withstand the drastic climate shocks that are happening today. So because of this colonialism, because of this extraction from the colonial powers, it has basically exacerbated the climate crisis. Another inequality, and this is both a past and present inequality, is racism. And basically, racism is a form of discrimination that distributes power according to hierarchy based on constructed racial categories. A good example here is in the UK, where with structural racism, we're seeing that areas that have a majority of people of color have very bad toxic air pollution, as opposed to areas that are predominantly white. So because of this structural racism, we are actually seeing that the impacts of climate change are very different, as opposed to, are very different because of the inequalities and because of how people actually look. The next slide. So all of this then calls for radical climate action. And of course, as the EE Collaborative, we are proposing a way to decolonize climate and health justice through public education. So what did we create? So we created the Envisioning Environmental Equity Educator's Guide to Climate and Health Justice. And it's basically a guide that takes on an anti-discriminatory approach to climate and health education. So the reason why we created this guide was because, at least from Uganda, most of the climate educators were asking us, how can we actually start to educate our young people and our communities in a more non-colonized or a less whitewashed form. So this is the honors of the EE guide. And it was, of course, created in collaboration with Climate Operation, Rest and Health, the University of Sao Paulo and YACAP. So we want to talk about who is it for. Next slide. So the guide was designed for educators, and by educators, we don't just mean institutional educators. Educators can be non-institutional educators, because when it comes to the climate crisis, we also have to acknowledge that most of the people that are educating their communities are in communities, and the fact that when it comes to the global south, most people don't actually have access to institutions to go to schools. So this guide was created for both institutional and non-institutional educators. And this is where health professionals come in, because health professionals as well can also be educators. Then it was also created for students, but however, students are not the main audience for this guide, but they can of course leverage it. And something interesting about this guide is that because it was intended for Brazil, the Philippines, and Uganda, it has a broad case of case studies in Brazil, Uganda, and the Philippines. So how can we use the guide? Next slide. So could we first go back to the first slide, the previous slide? So basically in this picture, we can see that the things that we added to the slide. So in the guide, we can use discussions with students. We included examples. We included prompts where you can localize an example. We included key concepts, reinforcement activities, and disclaimers. So next slide. So how to use this guide? First thing is we need to for one to use the guide, they would need to adapt it to the local context. When I was starting the speech before, I talked about how most of the climate education that we have today is very whitewashed and it's basically not relatable, especially to people in the global south. So something that we did with this guide and how we can actually use it is one, adapt it to your local context. The guide has examples from a variety of countries, case studies. However, that does not mean that these are the same impacts or these are the same examples that can be relatable to, like, for example, someone in Ghana or someone in Tunisia. So one of the things on how someone would actually maximize the guide is to adapt it to their local context by, of course, using examples in their country. Then another one is to use what's helpful for you. So with the guide, something that is also really good, and of course, this, at least we have experienced this, is that students now, or at least people, they know the basics of the climate crisis, so they might not actually need all the information that is in the guide. However, there are some aspects in the guide, for example, when it comes to how climate and health are related, or how someone can actually use, how someone can contribute to climate action. These might be interesting concepts for your students. So using what's helpful is also a very important thing. Then engaging your students. So when creating the guide, we of course talked about how it would be amazing if we actually leveraged a very engaging classroom. So this basically means ensuring that your students are asking questions, you're going through the activities with your students and ensuring that it's actually a very fun experience as opposed to the traditional way in which we teach in classrooms or the traditional way in which you basically teach people. So engaging your students is also another important thing when using the guide. And finally, the question and answer format. So the guide has a question and answer format, and this was basically created to ensure that the guide is very engaging and also explores the curiosity of the learners. So would also encourage you to use this question and answer format because that's going to actually enable you to, one, ask your students very interesting questions, but then also engage them and make sure that they explore some of these topics that they might not have thought about. And next slide. So where are we now? So at the moment, we are in phase 3, which is the feedback and piloting. We went through phase 1, which was stakeholder interviews, where we basically talked to policymakers, educators, and activists about some of the key things they would want to see in the guide. Then we went through a planning and structuring phase where we actually planned and structured how the guide would actually make sense. And then we are in phase 3, which is the feedback and piloting. So we took the guide back to the policymakers, the educators, the activists, and the students, and they gave us feedback on that. So now we are actually inputting that feedback into the guide, and then we'll pilot it to the world shortly. Final slide. And yeah, that is it. We'll be sharing this slide after the talk, but that was it for me, and I'm open to any questions. I think I kept it under 30 minutes, which is really good.
Yes, thank you, Hazel. Thank you so much. Okay, I don't know if we should jump straight to questions and answers, but thank you so much for that presentation. It was really nice. From what you have said, basically this can be used in any part of the world as long as it's stepped down to the local. You appear frozen on my screen. Sorry, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
All right.
So yes, Dr. Dauda, can you hear me as well?
All right, before we proceed, we don't have a very large audience base, so let's make it as interactive as possible. So I'd like to ask a question. You use the chat box to respond. Before the presentation that Hazel just delivered, is there any of you, were you aware that colonialism and racism are factors that affect responses to climate action? I mean, climate crisis. You just type yes or no in the chat box. Let's see what you think about it. Before this event, I'm not talking about now. Now, of course, yeah, you know about it. But before before she made that presentation, were you aware? Let's just see yes or no in the chat box. Colonialism and racism, ordinarily, one wouldn't think there are factors that can affect climate action because, yeah, when there is crisis, everybody is involved, everybody is to respond. But then, obviously, from my experience, from my research, I think it's something that affects it. So can we get from the audience, yes or no? Yes or no? Well,
okay,
we have
let me go to the chat and see what people are saying. Okay, Jarvis said no. Sherifat said yes.
All right, that's interesting. Wow. I, for one, before...
No, go on, Dr. Dauda, go on.
Yeah, so before I encountered the publication that spoke to the EA guide, well, I wouldn't think, well, I never, asked myself that question at these things that, but if someone mentioned that colonialism or racism are things that affect, responses to climate crisis, I would be a little bit doubtful. But then, yeah, look at it, it's happening. Though, well, Elias said yes. I agree with Elias. Elias is a tourist in Tanzania. He has done a lot for climate change and environmental promotion. So I assume, yeah, he must have had this kind of experience.
Yeah, he would know about it.
Yeah.
I for one, I didn't know about it. I didn't know that was a factor when it comes to climate action before like planning this whole episode 2 of OHS. I didn't think that it was an issue, or maybe it's because I didn't think it should be an issue, so I did not bother to check whether it was an issue or not. Yeah.
That's interesting. So just before we go, there'll be certificates for all participants. We decided to make that happen after the first one at scenarios episode. So if you didn't get your if you attended the first one, you didn't get a certificate, we're sorry about that. But moving forward, there'll be certificates for one of the scenarios episodes. Yeah, so we are seeing, okay, no other response. Sarah, do you have anything to say? Did you know anything about colonialism and racism having impact on climate response? Before now, TZ, I assume you're in Ethiopia. I didn't say. All right.
Bolanle, I can see Bolanle is here as well.
I find it interesting that people, okay, we have mixed reviews of no and yes. And if I'm being honest, I personally, before starting to do this work, I would agree with some of you whereby I did not actually expect something like colonialism to actually be something that that was kind of an attribute to the climate crisis, and actually not just an attribute to the climate crisis, but something that's exacerbating the impacts of the climate crisis. So these are kind of the things that, yes, they happened, but we think they are not there anymore, but we are still facing the impact. And I'd also just like to kind of like also speak on the fact that it's just not colonialism and racism that are the only inequalities that are exacerbating the climate crisis. Like, I would give you an example of Uganda. In Uganda, we have inequalities such as tribalism, we have inequalities such as gender inequality. So all these inequalities are actually exacerbating the climate crisis. An example, gender inequalities, that in Uganda, we have a majority of female farmers, and because of the climate crisis, these female farmers actually now cannot farm, and they are the breadwinners of their children. And not only are they the breadwinners of their children, but they also are the ones, in case their children fall sick or in case they fall sick, they are the ones who have to take care of them. So because of drought, because of floods, this all just kind of like, it overturns their livelihoods. So it's not just racism, it's not just colonialism, but it's kind of like a cluster of inequalities that the climate crisis just amplifies. So yes, I would say that I myself, at the beginning, I did not know that these were contributors, but of course, through the work, we now see that they actually are contributors. So yeah, I do agree with some of the responses as well.
Okay, that's amazing. Anyways, well, we still do a lot of work too, because one thing I've always reckoned with is without a planet, there's nothing else that can exist. And so far, whether locally or globally, there has been a lot of devastating activities by human beings to destroy the planet. So One Earth as a concept aims to, address some of the offshoots of this impact. For example, zoonosis. Well, there has been zoonosis right from the time that the world was created, but it has never gotten to a scale of inducing an emergency of, global scale. Yeah, so we are at a point where the impact of climate change is just cutting across almost all spheres of life, not just zoonotic diseases, antimicrobial resistance, for example. If we were in a balanced situation that you only get sick and that is when you need antibiotics, there won't be a problem. But now the increasing incidences of zoonotic infections calls for an increasing demand for antibiotics. And naturally, right from when antibiotics were discovered, the resistance is a natural process. So microbes become resistant to an antibiotic you're using against them frequently. So, and that is another consequence, like a secondary of climate change, bringing people closer to animals and wildlife generally, animals and plants that have pathogens that they are not normally used to, getting it, and then having to use antibiotics, causing resistance, and so on and so forth. And EMR actually has a socioeconomic impact in the sense that treatments don't get to work anymore. And, that means you need to spend so much more time and resources on treating yourself for common infections. So it's the chain of action, and that also piqued my interest. And when we're looking at approaches that can help solve global health problem, we now call it global health. Yes, of course, the health of all species is one, but I don't think we can arrive anywhere if we don't embrace this holistic approach, thinking about the causes, the primary causes of these things, for example, climate change. And well, yes, climate change is one and the most important of them, but to get people to understand it alone is a problem. So we can start taking questions if anybody has questions. Otherwise, I will be asking questions myself.
Okay, Dr. Dawson, I have a question actually, just kind of a follow-up question to what Hazel said, which I agree with, or things that I relate more with, is that there are a lot of other inequalities that is an issue, climate action and all that. And the one I'm interested in is gender equality, because we know that in Nigeria here, in our setting, in the community setting, it definitely applies. So my question to Isa will be, in community level, I'm not talking of the big dogs now, in community level, how do those who are trying to take climate action or do something with regards to climate action, how do they scale from these inequalities, especially like gender equality, for instance, which we know is a big issue and all that. So how do they scale in such a way that they are able to do their work effectively at the community level? I'm not even talking about anything big. in the smallest form of action that you can think. So how do they survive these inequalities and how do they overcome?
Good question. For one, you actually answered part of it. Kind of like they don't need to do something big. They kind of like need to start small. So I would give an experience from the work that we have done in climate operation. So we work with communities as well. And these communities, yes, they are the brunt of the climate crisis. But despite of the fact that they are the brunt of the climate crisis, they actually want to mitigate. Or yes, they basically want to do something to kind of take them out of the impacts of the climate crisis that they're in. And something that we have seen that has worked is bridging those gaps between them and their community policymakers. Because in Uganda, people do not have direct access to policymakers. But then the thing is, if they have direct access to those policymakers, then they can actually voice out their wants. And then we can just create a kind of like synergy for them to start creating what they actually want. So with climate operation, what we have done is we have actually started carrying out workshops where we bring community policy makers and the people in one room. And the first thing is, one, let the people actually speak, talk about the problems that are happening. And then in that same session, start to actually ideate solutions. So this shows the policymakers that these people are they just don't have problems, but they also have solutions. Because from Uganda, the policymakers, it just feels like a lot of work for them to also create the solutions for you. So with climate operation, what we are doing is we are creating these spaces for them to have conversations around the problem, but then also ensuring that they also start to ideate solutions. So coming back to you, Damilola, in Nigeria, something I would say that women in communities could do, at least to kind of like take themselves out of that situation whereby they're only in the phases of problems, would be, for one, to collaborate with each other, because when we come together, we can actually create solutions. So basically not working in silos, that's the first thing. And then the second thing I would say, which you answered yourself, is to start small, because the climate crisis is quite big and its impacts are quite broad as well. So we cannot solve all of it at once. So kind of starting small is also something very key. And I know this is very far-fetched. I might be a bit naive about it. Feel free to correct me, but ensuring that we create these kind of collaborations with the people in power, the people that actually can make decisions, because it's those people that are going to make sure that these changes that the women in these communities want to create, that they actually stick and remain in those communities. So also ensuring that you kind of create those spaces whereby these two synergies are created and they start working together.
Yeah, thank you so much. That makes a lot of sense, actually. Thank you so much, Aizal. So I think some other people have dropped questions. Mita is asking a question. She said, combating racism and colonialism. How can they tackle this issue in the context of climate change? That's her number one question. Then she has a second question. How does education impact? So, Aizal, should I go again?
Oh no, I heard you. So the first question is basically, what's the role of health professionals in combating racism and colonialism, and basically how can they tackle this issue in the context of climate change? Mm-hmm. I would say as health professionals, okay, I'm not a health professional, but I would say that people in this webinar are health professionals. You see these inequalities every day in the work that you do, right? And the people that you are seeing have largely been impacted by the climate crisis, because now the climate crisis is embedded in everything, right? So say if someone comes to you and they have a respiratory issue, high chances are that might be because of pollution. So we see this, it's all embedded. So I think one of the things I would advise health professionals to do, one, would be to educate themselves on the inequalities. That's the first thing. Because when you come from a space of knowledge is when you can actually act. So the first thing is to educate yourself. And then the next thing is after this education. So basically now you know that these people are just not coming because they have this, say, physical health or mental health issue, but this physical or mental health issue is actually attributed to this inequality. Then from that knowledge, that is when you can actually treat them with more empathy. You can also, to a point, and I know I'm taking it back to policy, but I believe health professionals, again, and I know not all, but health professionals also have access to policy. You can, again, take these needs or these issues to the higher people to actually change the policies. Because I'll take you back to Uganda. Most of our health policies are actually made by health professionals. But at the moment, our health policies do not take into consideration the inequalities that people are facing, because the health professionals do not know, or they know, but it's still not broad enough for them to understand that inequalities are actually attributing to these mental and physical health impacts. So I would then also challenge the health professionals to now take this knowledge and what they have seen to policy, because when policies change, then that will make sure that things actually are positive. So that would be the thing I would do. And
all right, sorry, I agree with you on that. But since you're not a health professional, I happen to be a vet, I'd like to contribute a little in this case. Now, when we say health professionals, it's a broad term. It covers human and animal health professionals. I am an animal health professional, but I'll speak for both. Now, in human health practice, when you have, let's say, patients, for example, that have respiratory infections or respiratory issues that might be as a result of pollution, now, the quality of the treatment that you deliver to people based on their race, based on their economic background, based on, shouldn't differ. But that is not what we see, especially in the global south. People that are of higher economic classes tend to get better treatment and better everything than people that are in the lower class. And gender also plays a role in the sense that a particular gender tends to have affinity for either the opposite gender or the same gender, and they give them better treatment regarding that. So these are inequalities that should be addressed within the health system. So what I would say, what I recommend for health professionals is to create a system and enforce, be agents of the change that we want to see, be the ones to enforce and make sure everybody gets treated equally, regardless of their background, regardless of whether they are, but okay, for example, the UNHCR, the High Commission on Refugees in Nigeria, they have a program for Cameroonians, and the quality of health that can give them, let's say, a little bit better than what Nigerians are getting. Why not collaborate with the government of the country to have a system where everybody that comes in, whether refugees or indigenes of the country, actually get equal treatment at, let's say, a flat rate or equal costs, so that all these inequalities we're talking about will be eliminated by the professionalism that the health professionals depict. And there's also one thing in the curriculum of health professionals for animal or human health, all of these colonialism, racism, gender bias are not represented enough. In fact, if they are represented at all. So, and they exist, these are things we see on a daily basis, and we have to reckon with them. The earlier, the better for us. We have to accept at this point that yes, people have been treated equally by us, by the health professionals themselves, because of probably the economic class they come from or whatever. So regardless of what has induced the etiology of the condition they are dealing with, for example, we said respiratory infection because of air pollution, sometimes GIT issues because of flooding and poor water quality. Regardless of what might have caused what the condition they are presenting, we have to treat them equally and not use high quality treatments for a certain demography and then low quality treatment for a certain demography. So I think this is something Then at the curricular level, like I have said, all these inequalities need to be brought into perspective so that health professionals, as they graduate into practice, they understand, they come with the understanding that they would encounter situations that would tempt them to treat people unequally, but we are all the same. And yeah, if the planet goes down, we all go down. Climate crisis doesn't discriminate. We shouldn't discriminate if we don't want all of us to just go away with it. And yeah, tackling the issue is an individual thing for health professionals. And it is also like an institutional thing for them. Institutional in the sense that I just made an example of curricular changes, and I'll just say something about policies. So these are the high-level changes at the institutional level that can be induced to, promote equality in the kind of treatment that people get. Then at the individual level, I think, like Hazel said, health professionals need to educate themselves about the kind of scenarios that will translate into the inequalities we're talking about, whether it's gender or otherwise, right? So it's only when they know that this is the situation they have at hand that they can make the best decisions on it. So that will be my contribution for now. I think, Ethel, you can answer the next question, so I give a ride on.
Yes. Elsa, should I repeat the second question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So Mita says, how does education impact discrimination and climate-related health impacts? Did you get it?
Yeah, interesting question. So first of all, we need to acknowledge that not everyone has access to institutional education. I know that is very different from the global south versus global north, because I would say in the global north, despite of the fact that the public education system also has its own negatives, it's for everyone, so you have access to it, as opposed to the global south, whereby not everyone has access to education. So because of the fact that they do not have access to this education, that means that they're actually not informed. Not only are they not informed, for example, on general aspects of, say, knowledge, but when relating it to climate and health, they're also not informed of their rights when it comes to health, but they're also just not informed about health in general. So I think that is why when it comes to like ensuring that this education is public, that is why we have created a guide that is not just for institutional educators, but a guide for community educators, because we are seeing that health professionals are going into the communities and actually educating people, especially communities that have been impacted by the climate crisis. Climate activists are also going into the communities and educating people about climate change. But because there's just not that resource for them to educate communities in a very anti-discriminatory way, and that is also related to health. So this is also a very good resource for them. So with the EE guide, we're ensuring that communities that have been from time and time again just being discriminated against now have access to these resources. And now that they have access to these resources, one, they'll actually now be informed about their rights when it comes to health, but they also now understand what they can do when something happens. So yeah, that is what I would say on that.
Yeah, excellent. I love that response. It's encompassive, it captures.
Okay, thank you so much, Haidal. Okay, so any other questions, Dr. Dauda? Do you have any addition or follow-up question?
Yeah, of course. So about the last response that Eza gave, I think that was encompassive enough. But I'll just add that before we get to the point where these kind of like the EE guide, for example, being a very useful tool that can be used, that can be institutionalized and taught in classes, everything. Before we get to that point, the onus is on us as climate actors and One Earth advocates to really take advantage of the out-of-class education system that is becoming more popular now, to educate people about climate change and the impact of climate change on health, and the discriminations, the inequalities that exist at the interface between the crisis and the response. Well, basically, that is what it's about. And, before we get to the point where this is going to be institutional, because when you look at the education systems, the health systems, they also have a role they are presently playing in inducing these discriminations. They are either not recognizing it at all hypocritically, or they are being lopsided in the recognition. So before we get to that point, we need to educate the general public so they can join us in the fight for equality when it comes to climate response, regardless of the race, regardless of the gender. And so we can eliminate the colonial effect that is still persistent in many spheres of the lives of people in the global south. So that is one way education can help, but I'm just trying to give a narration of the role that we also have to play on our own. We are all at the receiving end, and then if we have chosen to make changes happen in this regard, then we should be the drivers of the change that we want to see. So this is just a call to action for everybody to take advantage of. Well, for now, we have the guide. It's the only one of its type that I know in the world. I don't know if there's any other toolkits that recognizes the changes, like the discriminations and the inequalities that exist at the interface between climate crisis and responses. But then we should take up, if there's any other one we can use it, but the EE guide, for example, I know, yes, it's comprehensive enough and it's case-based. And as you can see, there are only like 3 countries still being mentioned in the EE guide. It doesn't mean other countries cannot be incorporated. We can make it a global thing that can go worldwide. For example, I might decide to work with Hazel now to incorporate some scenarios from Nigeria, and then we have a participant from Morocco. They can do that, and that way we build the EE guide. We make sure, we play our part in eliminating these discriminations, regardless of the dimension they come in. Okay, does anybody have any question? Please type in the chat box, or you're free, use the Q&A chat, otherwise I would ask the question. My question is not, do I say it's not a question, basically more of a request for a recommendation, but
Okay. I don't see any other question, Dr. Dauda.
Okay. So now, if my question to Isa will be, if a country wants to participate in the EE guide developments, like incorporate case scenarios from their country into the guide, and how do they go about that? Is there anybody to contact, and how do they go about that, basically?
Interesting. So I would say that at the moment, the EE guide was made with case studies from Uganda, Brazil, and the Philippines. However, we are adding case studies from other countries. So basically, we're now adding case studies from the US, from the UK, basically from all over the world, because just as we spoke earlier, the climate crisis is impacting us worldwide, and we want to kind of like depict all these instances. So I would say, upon piloting the EE guide, and it's now out to the world and everyone now is using it, if someone sees it and is like, this my country's instances might actually be very good for the EE guide, they could reach out, and on the second version of the EE guide, we could just implement that, because I would say that when it comes to what we are developing at the moment, we are open to feedback and we're open to reiterating it so that it's perfect for everyone that's using it. So if someone wants to add their case studies to it after piloting it to the world, then that's fine. But also, like, outside of them adding it inside the EE guide, something that I would encourage, which takes me back to how to use the guide. Localizing the guide is advisable, because just like I said, what's happening with the climate crisis is not the same everywhere. And that has been a problem when it comes to climate education. It's very whitewashed. All the examples are very, I don't want to say they are based on the global north. So basically like ice caps melting, polar bears dying. And that is not very relatable, you know, to the global south. So localizing the guide is advisable. So regardless of the fact that, say, it does, your case study does not have to be in the guide for you to use it with your students, because these are things that are happening in our countries. These are actual instances that our communities are going through. So using these instances, using these examples with your learners is also really advisable and key, because one, it's going to ensure that your learners better understand what you're actually talking about, but then it's also going to ensure that it's more engaging. Because for me personally, before I joined the climate space, I was not really engaged with it because I could not relate to it, because that was not what was happening in my country. But now that I have actually started creating resources that are engaging and I actually see relatabilities, is now that I actually want to create more. So yes, we could add the case studies to the guide, but before we add the case studies to the guide, you could also localize it in your context and make sure that your students actually understand the case studies in their country.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. And I assume, you know, to get more on like the examples of the kind of cases we're talking about, so we have to go through the EE guide. I'd appreciate if you can maybe share some links in the chat box so that people can go see the EE guide afterwards and see the stage of development it's in. And there are many youths that are looking forward to developing guides like these, or kids, toolkits, and whatever. As a matter of fact, at OHIA, we are working on quite a number of kits that would, you know, come together to form a conglomerate of a One Health implementation framework. Yeah. Something very actionable that anybody can pick up, read, and relate with, and then, you know, try as much as they can to implement what is in it, and also contribute to the movement that aims at, you know, bringing One Health into relatable action. I appreciate that. And well, here in the global, in Nigeria, for example, in the northwestern part, there has been flooding since last year. They have had the issues of flooding during rainy seasons, and that prevented people from having access to clean water to drink. And there was an outbreak of cholera in one of the states. I think that's a good scenario if anybody wants to look into it. But yeah, I agree with you. Thank you very much. And then you're mentioning students. Not to confuse the audience, we don't mean university students or secondary school students. No, I mean students is audience. Anybody you have the opportunity to train with the tool is your audience, and those are your students at that point. And you're just trying to, you know, induce action, making sure they come on board and, you know, they try to use it or learn from the experience that is, and they know the action they are supposed to take when they find themselves in certain situation. Yeah. Dami, you have something to say?
No, Dr. Dauda, I think you've wrapped up everything beautifully. I just want to say Mita has dropped the link to the EEE guide and also a link to check out climate operations work. So I'll just so everybody can know that they have access to it, the links are in the chat box. You can pick it up from there and, you know, go through everything yourself. Okay. Solomon says, Hazel, thank you so much for the interesting talk. I totally agree with you about localizing the EEE guide. However, what are the baseline that must be kept in focus away from the whole concept of the guide? Yeah. So I think that's supposed to be a question. What are the baselines that must be kept in focus to not drift away from the whole concept of the guide?
Okay. Yeah, so basically, when it comes to the guide, it has, we created it with prompts. So basically these prompts ensure that as an educator who is using the guide can make sure that your students are as comfortable with discussing these topics, because some of these topics are very sensitive, right? So like, for example, if you're talking about the health impacts of the climate crisis, and you're thinking about this health impact in a community that has actually directly been faced by these health impacts, these are very sensitive topics to talk about. So some of the things to keep in mind when using the EE guide, for example, like we're talking about localizing it, right? One thing I would recommend is, one, to acknowledge and just basically tell your learners that this is a safe space where we are going to talk about these impacts. However, if you're not comfortable speaking about these impacts at this moment, then we won't speak about them. So then that means that you kind of not necessarily not localize it, but don't go deep into certain things that might be too sensitive for your learner.
Sensitive.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think that would be one of the best lines to keep, to ensure that it's a safe space for everyone and they are not kind of like triggered. Then something else to also keep in mind while using the guide is that because we want the EE guide to be very collaborative, we want it to be very engaging, it would be recommended to make this a very out of classroom experience. And that is why with the guide, we have included examples, we have included activities. So as opposed to giving a lecture with the guide, it's advised to actually use activities. And also, if you feel like these activities may not be relatable to your context, form your own activities so that your students are as engaged as possible. Because with the EE guide, we are trying to take you out of a classroom setting. So basically a very institutionalized form of education, right? And taking you outside of that. So that might also be a baseline to keep, make sure that it's engaging as possible. And then finally, what I would recommend with the guide is follow your students, right? Because for me, when I was at school, the way in which we were being educated was kind of like, we shall just keep going, you know? Like, I don't care if you've understood or what, so we shall just keep going.
Yeah.
So with the EE guide, something that we would recommend is follow your students. And that is why we say that use what is important for you. So you could literally just ask your students that, what do you guys want to speak about today? And that is what you speak about. So do not take it kind of like, teach it chapter 1 to the last chapter, but rather follow what your students want to engage in. Because we want this to be as fulfilling and as holistic as possible. So those are some of the best lines to keep in mind while using the guide.
Okay. Thank you, Aizal. That makes a lot of sense. Especially you saying that you don't have to be rigid. I think that is the word. Don't have to be rigid with keeping up to it step by step by step. Because I mean, different communities, different things are obtainable there. So based on what I think also another thing is based on your own observation of the space, you can determine the best foot to put forward with that, in that setting, with those people that you've met and all that. And even something as basic as going through their community leaders or youth leaders, they will already give you a step down into the picture. They'll give you a picture of what's going on so you can know the best way to actually approach the issues that the people consider important. Because you can think something is important in the grand scheme of things, and to the people it might not actually be their problem or their first, it might not be priority for them. So it's important to flow with what the people consider as like priority to them. Yeah, I think that's what I just wanted to add.
Yeah, then also maybe just like as a final baseline, because the EE guide is focused on climate and health. So something to keep while educating using this guide is to ensure that your students are actually understanding the intersectionalities that come with climate and health, and always going back to that, because that is something that we actually want people, communities to understand, and not to just understand the intersectionalities that come with climate and health, but to also understand how the different inequalities, one, attribute to the negative impacts of climate change, but also how communities can actually use this guide to take climate action. So those are also some of the things to take into consideration when using the guide.
Yeah, that's great. All right. So just the last thing I'm going to add to that is to involve an individual component, like to appeal to by involving individual component, I mean, appealing to the interests of your audience. Yeah, I wouldn't use the word student, your audience. So when you try to use prompts that appeal to a common consequence of a climate crisis that recently happened in an area, you tend to get more attention to induce more action in them than when you are generic about it, talking at the communal level. For example, if you're living in a place, yeah, you should tell them, okay, when was the last time you got to drink clean water? Or if there's been an increase in the price of water, be like, okay, the price you're buying water now, is this the same price you're buying it before? Why is it cheap in some place? And, so when you are talking about climate crisis, you should try to relate. If you get a little bit backward history of the place, I think you'll be able to pick examples that people can reckon with. Okay, in so place, is it normally this art in like 5-10 years ago? If no, then yeah, we have done something. Yeah, every action calls for a reaction. That's why we're introducing this, and yeah, you can proceed from there. When you attract their interest right from the onset of the let's say the class you're taking them through, or the education program you're about to take them through, I think they tend to have more interest, and whatever recommendation that comes there, they will take it up. And one other thing I want us to reckon with is that we are the ones that caused climate change, not aliens from. So there are things that we should also stop doing. There are things we should start doing. And we should always reckon with that. The way we use plastic, single-use plastic, the way we use non-renewable energy and all of that have impact on the climate. So we should put all these things into consideration. These are things that affect people's socio-economic welfare. And when you bring all this into perspective, they will appreciate what you're saying, and they will want to, they want to engage with you in whatever you say. Dami, I think we have a question or a comment in the chat box.
Okay. I think, Samira says, very interesting thoughts. Can you send us all the links for continuing this talk and work? Samira, for Haizal, I think Mita already dropped the link to climate operations work in the chat box. So you can just go through and you see it. And then for OHIA, you can keep up with us on LinkedIn at One Health in Action Initiative, and across other social media platforms, I think Twitter and Instagram as well. So we post updates regularly there on our activities, what we are doing at the moment, what we plan to do. So you can keep up with us on LinkedIn, especially One Health in Action Initiative. And if you go through the chat box, you see the link to climate operations work as well. Yeah. So that's the last comment, Dr. Dauda.
All right, that's great. Thank you very much. That was another wonderful session. I think the guide is pretty much novel in so many settings, and it's something we are willing to partner with climate operations on, with like disseminating or propagating the use of the guide, and also incorporating some case scenarios from Nigeria. I'm based in Nigeria right now, and I can, give relevant examples, and neighboring countries. Yeah, like I told you, I'm visiting Cameroon very soon. If I think things I can relate with the locals there, and just through some information, and we can continue to expand it that way. And I would urge everyone on the call to also do something similar. Yeah, it can be enough. And if it's a live tool that is growing, that takes everybody's input, I think it's everybody will want to reckon with it and to take action based on it, because you want to identify with a movement that is constantly growing, and not the
Exactly.
fixed thing that we know, the in-class lectures, like you said, people just start lectures in class and they just want to finish it so that you know what you're supposed to know constantly, and it doesn't grow. The education system globally doesn't give room for so much of growth within it. It's excellent room for growth in that people want to publish and do all that. Why not, discuss publications in class and, especially in the global south, you don't see that kind of benefit. But then, yeah, it's a good thing. And I don't know if Dan wants to call on me to deliver the closing and then announce some activities or whatever, or I should go ahead.
Okay. Okay, yes, Dr. Dauda, but before you do that, I just want to say to all the attendees, just like Dr. Dauda said, don't be afraid to put this to test in your locality. And I think overall, just make sure that wherever you are in touch with the people's reality as much as you can be. I mean, like, for instance, now, Dr. Dauda, for us in Nigeria, I can't go to Kogi State where they just witnessed flooding, and I'm asking them about the ice in the North Pole melting or polar bears and all that. I mean, that's way out of touch with their reality, you get? Yeah. So in whatever you do in using this tool, the aim is to actually have results and positive results, not just for you to tell people about something and just go away. You should actually be able to see that it's causing a change, a move of change, behavioral change at the very least, in issues that are related to climate and climate action. So, Dr. Dauda, you have the floor to close. I just want to say thank you, Hazel, for very wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Dauda. You can take it away. And don't forget our pictures at the end.
Yeah,
I always remind you.
Yeah, sure. But today we are using a proper Zoom webinar, so that might not really be easy. But yeah, for the panelists, I think we can do that. It's not a problem. So there's a question inside the chat box for me from Solomon. I hope I didn't miss any other one. Yeah, this should be a talk to action. And then what will be the action moving forward? So we are collaborating with Climate Operations and all the other organizations that are involved in the development of the EE guide now to, adopt it and use it locally ourselves. We have people, boots on ground, people that will educate locals, people around them about the EE and, the discriminations that come using local cases. So for that to happen, we want to see if we will be able to, incorporate some of these case scenarios that are relevant to locals in Nigeria. As you have heard, like 3 countries are already there, but we want to incorporate examples from Nigeria into the guide if possible before we use it here. If we can, fine. If we can't, then we can still proceed to use the basic educational framework of the guide to, engage people and let them understand the inequalities that are attached to climate change and climate response. I mean, responses to climate change, sorry. Because, yeah, like I said, everywhere in the world, we are facing climate crisis. In California, in the United States, I don't know if you guys see it in the news, there's always flooding and heavy rains and tornadoes and whatever, almost on a daily basis in the news. It has been happening in the past, but not at this intensity and quantity. It happens very frequently now. So it's a problem in the world, and yeah, we need to take action. So for you to be able to help us in the talk to action work, you should also go to the EE guide, see how you can use it. So if you need help trying to maybe set up a lecture or get an audience or something, you can reach out to us. I will drop our email in the chat box before we end the meeting. And then, yeah, you can, at any point in time, you can request for help from OHIA to host or to use the EE guide in Nigeria. We want to be the Nigerian hub for this movement. Yeah, we want everybody to understand how important climate is to everything we do in our daily lives. So I assume that answers your question. Is there any other one before I proceed? Okay. Chris,
Dr. Dauda, I think Jarvis. Yes.
Okay, yeah, okay. So how do we ensure you
how do you ensure, yeah. No, go on, Dr. Dauda, go on.
All right, so I think I can answer this question, but Maita can, add one or two things if I didn't answer it correctly. So you are the one to take it to rural areas. We are talking about localizing the guide using relevant examples at the baseline. What you're supposed to do is you can even translate to your local language and deliver it in your local language. It doesn't have to We don't have to know that you have translated it. You understand? When you adopt it, the framework of how to engage people, the prompt questions, you can use your local language and then, narrate it to people and make sure people in rural communities use it. For us in Nigeria, the partnership we're proposing, we want to localize it as much as possible. Make sure we have people, at least one person in every state, to use the guide and use the language that is spoken in that place. And like I said, this is a soft material, unlike the class materials in one language and very rigid. No, this is a material that is very flexible and can be used based on the situation that you're in. So it's not just the cases in it that is flexible. The use of this EE guide itself is also flexible. I want to take advantage of that and make everybody, if possible, or as many people as possible in the world to really understand climate and health justice. And I think that is the way to go for getting it to reach the local people. So the development of the guide, I think at this phase we can say is done, almost done. But getting it to people is our work. Yeah, I'm saying it's our work because we have to take responsibility. We won't leave it to climate operations, race and health, and blah, 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 to do all the job. They might not be able to cover the entire global south. We have 3 continents that we refer to as global south. But you and I, being climate actors, can actually take this guide and take it to where it is actually needed. And that is the call to action. I like calling people to action. That's why there's action in our name. Anyways, Ezra, do you have anything to add?
I know, right, Dr. Dauda? Yeah. Now our work, that's our work.
Yeah. I guess just to clarify, so at the moment, the guide that is online is a draft guide. So the guide that will be releasing to the public is one where we have actually implemented feedback, because we took it back to the communities and got feedback from them. So yes, it is almost done. It will be out by July, I reckon. And yeah, it's not just on us, the collaborators of Envisioning environmental equity to disseminate the guide, but it's on, like, for example, collaborations like this with Dr. Dauda and like the people in the community to disseminate the guide. If you believe that your community would want the guide in a different language, that is also allowed, because again, we want it to be as non-colonial as possible, and we acknowledge that not everyone speaks English, but English is all-encompassing. So if you feel like your community would be better served with a guide in your local language, feel free to translate it. If you feel like some of the case studies in the guide might not be relevant to your community, feel free to use your own case studies. So the guide is just, what's the word? It's a guide to guide you to educate better, right? So you can transform it to what you want, as long as you stick to the main key aspects of, like we talked about, the baselines of educating with it.
Okay, thank you so much, Hazel. So for those that are interested in using the guide or having something to do at all with the guide, and in Nigeria, if you're in Nigeria and we can relate to local realities with one another, I'll drop my email now and our official email at OHIA, so that you can just reach out to us. We'll help with anything we can help with, whatever we have in our possession to help with, so that you can, use it to train. If we need to call climate operations or any of the collaborators and the guide in, we can be the interface between you and them. But yeah, so we will, we are always up to help. And one other thing you should all bear in mind is that OHIA is not like the bureaucratic organization that you used to know. It's open to everyone. You can be involved in any way. If you have anything to do, you need our help. We are always there. And yeah, if you have queries about us, you have anything at all you think we can be useful for you, and yes, we are always up. We try as much as we can to establish a youthful and energetic and forward-thinking network of youth that want the world to be healthy. Yeah, I am a vet. I'm the executive director, but we have social scientists, we have environmental scientists, we have, what is it that we don't have on board? Well, a lot of things, but I can't think of any right now. So we have a lot of people that, well, and some of our members don't even have, they have the basic sciences as their primary degree or whatever, but they have skills in other aspects that they can actually help you with. And so for this part, I'm supposed to make announcements about our upcoming events, and then, yeah, close before we take our picture and stuff. So we will not be having One Else Scenarios episode 3 anytime soon. I'm sorry about that. It's going to be replaced by OHIA Open Day. So we want to have, yeah. So yeah, that means tipping you guys. So we want to have a session where all OHIA executives and all the volunteers will, introduce themselves, what they do, where they are from, and why they are interested in One Health, the aspect of One Health they are interested in, and how they think you can also contribute, and just basically saying a lot about themselves, and not dragging you to come to OHIA, yeah, but telling you the role that you can play. You can also play in establishing One Health. That is just to reinforce our stand that we are not a bureaucratic establishment. We are just a network of youth that want change in like the global health system. Yeah. So we have OHIA Open Day coming. And then, but well, in 2 days, we will be releasing the first episode of our past podcast, Prioritizing Antimicrobial Stewardship. And we urge everyone to listen to it. It's just an 18 minutes long with a professional, a Spanish professional in Germany about antimicrobial resistance and some new technologies she's working on to combat antimicrobial resistance. Then we opened a call for application for volunteers recently, and we were significantly overwhelmed by the number and the quality of applications we received. We're still suffering at the back end to select like a few out of so many, and we received applications from almost 30 countries in the world. We don't even know how to go about that. But one thing about OHIA, like I said, we're just a network, so we hate saying no. When someone approaches that they want to be a part of us, we don't like saying no. And now we have to say no to about 60 people, and I can wrap my head around that. So we are trying to create maybe working groups and teams to put them in so that we can accommodate everyone. But regardless, we are not going to say no to everybody. We are going to put everybody in a pool when time comes and we need people, because our model is the network kind of model. So we always need people taking charge of, a lot of things. So when the time comes and then we need people, yeah, we can pick from the previous applicants. We won't open a new call for applications so that we won't just send people away.
Yeah.
And that will be all from me. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. It's always, especially for people in this part of the world, we understand what it means for you to get a strong network, where you have data to attend this kind of events. Yeah, it's not easy. I really appreciate the fact that people, despite all of those kind of things, take their time to attend. And yeah, for the call, we had someone from USA initially. There's someone from Morocco, Tanzania, and that is what we're talking about in the OHIA. We want a network that covers the entire globe, but doing something that induces local action in communities. Yeah. So thank you. There's still so much more to hear from us. There's a lot of things. We have a course we are planning. We are trying to put up a library for people. And yeah, we're just trying as much as we can to do everything to benefit everyone so that, we have a better global health system that is not dependent on a bureaucracy, on a vertical structure, but on a network of people sharing knowledge and expertise across the board. So thank you. And we hope to see you on our open day. Well, it's not, well, I understand this is a fun event, an interactive session, but you know, the open day is gonna be more fun. Yeah.
Yes.
That we can about that. So thank you and see you again very soon.
Yes, thank you everybody. We appreciate your time. Please come for the open day when it's announced. We want to hear a lot of ideas for you. I want to have fun with you guys as well. Thank you, Hazel, so much. Thank you so much for taking our time.
So you can all turn on your camera for the last 1 minute. What we do is, okay, our participants cannot turn on their camera. Oh, sorry. So Mita, you can turn on the camera. So what we do,
I think Mita is here. Mita can help us. Can they?
Okay, allow them to hear.
To turn on their camera.
Mita, is it possible for them to turn on their camera?
Let me see.
Or since there are not many, if we can upgrade all of them to panelists or something, and then they can turn on their camera.
Okay.
Yeah, so we always like to take one big picture at the end of our event. So the last 60 seconds, it's all about everybody smiling and saying goodbye. It's a practice. Yeah. So that's to tell you, we don't just shut the camera on everybody that get out. The event is over. No. Yeah. So the event is not over until we take a picture of everyone coming together. And yeah, we hope to have some of you when we host our physical events in Nigeria and probably in some other. Oh, Dr. Samira. Hello.
Hi, Dr. Samira.
Okay, now you can all turn on your camera and then yeah.
Hi, Solomon.
Okay. Right. Bolande is our media advisor.
Yeah.
Yeah, hello.
Hi, Bolande. Okay. Hi,
Iniolua, Esther.
I can see you.
Infinite Hot 9. Please send me your name so that
your name.
Please type your name in the chat box so that I can make your certificate, please.
Hi, Tizzy.
Yeah, okay.
Hi.
I hope I'm
Dr. Tizzy.
Hi,
I mean, I've been meaning to reach out to you. How is it going?
Hi, Tanzania Secret PD.
Yes.
Yeah. Elias.
Okay, Mustafa in Yolua.
Yeah, Dr. Jarvis. Dr. Jarvis and his cap.
Nice to see you.
Okay, Dr. Dowd, are you using your PC? I think you can take the screenshot for us.
Yeah. So I'm taking the shots. Already. Yeah.
Okay. Please smile, everyone. Smile like it.
Smile. Yeah. We are taking a selfie here. Please. Yeah, it's good. All right. Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Thank
and
you,
we
guys.
hope to see you on the open day.
Thank you.
Do some more things.
Thank you.
Dr. Tizzy, I'm going to send you a text message. We may partner with Afro very soon.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So.
Thank you, Hazel. You didn't smile. I didn't see
all right.
smile.
It's how the almighty presenter. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you.
We'll do as much as we can to bring the guide to everybody's doorstep, and yeah, especially in Nigeria for now, but we'll also take it to other countries. I'm close to Cameroon. I can always jump there. Yeah, so I mean, yeah. All right, Nathaniel, thank you. So that will be all. Thank you, everyone. Mita,
bye, guys.
We can go now.
Bye.
Thank you, Mita.
Bye. Thank you.